Alexander the Great's original vision of Alexandria's intellectualism came when he was only in his 20s. It was so strong that it became the foremost place in history for fundamental understandings, provided a center for some of the greatest minds ever, and its contributions would continue for hundreds of years. He died at the age of 32, but imagine if he had lived a normal length of life. Alexandria might have been his home for decades. While in India, Alexander encountered various yogis, including one who traveled with him. Aristotle, Alexander's childhood teacher, had taught him the greatness of the yogis. The yogis would bring into question the life which Alexander was living, a life of greed and conquering. I believe this had a profound effect on Alexander. A short time later, he became enlightened, but unfortunately, it occurred at the end of his life. He then warned against the obsessive pursuit of wealth and power. He had the trail to his burial lined with gold and silver, so people would realize that death separates us from our material goods. He ordered his hands to be left outside his coffin to show we come into the world with nothing and we leave with nothing. He also tried to convey the message of how precious life is. Alexander was probably the great visionary in history. Enlightened on top of that, he would have kept his empire united and collaborative. Given a few more decades to live, I believe he would have figured out how to structure his legacy to continue his ambitions. The golden age of Alexandria would have likely lasted far beyond its 88 years, and maybe even indefinitely. I state indefinitely because there is a point of no return. This is when society and/or the world is wholly focused on a dedication to the advancement of humanity. This is when we consistently ask how we can stop or minimize the biggest problems of the world. I believe this would have happened. Had Alexander lived, he would have turned his efforts towards developing humanity to its fullest extent. I strongly believe this would have prevented the Dark Ages, and we may very well be 2,000 to 3,000 years more advanced now. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking. Several years later, after Alexander died, Chandragupta arose and formed the Mauryan Empire. This empire was the first to rule most of what is now India. Under his grandson, Ashoka, the kingdom extended to include Pakistan and well into Afghanistan. Later in life, Chandragupta gave up his throne, material possessions, and became a Jain monk with the Wandering Jain group. Jains believed that we liberate ourselves by removing all karma from the soul. The soul then continues eternally in bliss, much the same as the concept of heaven. A similar realization of Alexander's would happen a short time later in the Indian ruler Ashoka after he inherited his grandfather's, Chandragupta's, kingdom. Like Alexander, Ashoka is one of those people in history who have become known as the Great. Ashoka was a brilliant strategist, born 304 BC. After a devastating but decisive war victory, Ashoka in 260 BC walked among the ruins and was horrified by what he saw, by what he caused. I haven't seen it in print, but I assume he was influenced by Alexander's, and certainly by his grandfather's, enlightenment. He then turned his efforts towards peace and building of his kingdom. I'll learn more about him for a future episode. Ashoka was partially Greek on his mother's side. Alexandria, in its golden age, had at least some diplomatic relations with Ashoka. Oshaka too was very open to knowledge and gave it a considerable effort to try to understand the nature of life the best he could. Alexandria probably acquired a number of books from India and Oshaka, particularly on Buddhism. The eastern remains of Alexander's empire were the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, who maintained close relationships with Oshaka. They did cultural exchanges, and Greek Buddhist monks were found among the Indian population. The Chinese had already been strongly philosophical by the time of Alexander, with Taoism and Confucianism. Mencius, a Confucius philosopher, was about the same time as Alexander. He spent his life traveling and teaching rulers how they should treat their subjects. His advice was enlightened, influential, and he looked to the potential of both the ruler and his subjects in giving his advice. China at the time was made up of wealthy and powerful kingdoms. They would later become one towards the end of what was Oshaka's life and the end of the golden age of Alexandria. What if enlightened Alexander, who would have lived to a normal age, his successors, Mencius, influenced China, Chandragupta, and later Oshaka, had collaborated? The three were of a similar mindset. Collaboration to better acquire knowledge for project building and exploration. The Chinese did send envoys to Alexander's eastern kingdoms to develop the Silk Road. I am sure other nations would have followed and added to this. Alexander's empire, Chandragupta, Oshaka's India, and China were by far the most powerful and wealthy empires of their time. We as humanity then came to the cusp of such an idea. We were there, and what could have been. One thing Oshaka didn't figure out was how to preserve his enlightened ideologies and for his kingdom to endure in his aftermath. But I believe that the man who was probably the most influential non-religious figure in history, Alexander, would have figured this out had he lived into the old age. Then Oshaka would have done the same. Reaching advancements of anything beyond 100 years of where we are today would be dependent on our ability to get beyond our propensity for war, extreme violence, our creation of sociopaths, and I believe an enlightened world would have figured out how to move beyond such barbarism, simplicity, ignorance, and primitive thinking. The next episode will look more at where we might be if we had done things differently, and that we might be 3,000 years or more advanced had the contents of this episode happened. The focus will be more on things pertaining to our modern world. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.